Hello and welcome to another episode of Coach's Corner. I got Ramses and Tony joining myself, Charles. And Ramses, why don't you tell the viewers what the topic is for today?
Yeah, so as you guys know, we do run Discord memberships, and there's a channel in the Discord where the members can ask their questions, and we do our best to answer all the questions. Now we're almost caught up. There's one more question that came in just recently from Qylwok. Huge shout outs to them, and they ask about simplicity. So let me read what they asked us. Qylwok says, I always loved to play Joker because I love his universe, his style, and his viability in Smash, but I have always been frustrated to play him. I train him a lot, I play him a lot, and Furycraft a lot about him, but I don't find too much success with him. And I feel like it will never be as good as my Incineroar, who is more forgiving and simpler. I don't play Incineroar too often, but I find a lot more success when I do play him, which is frustrating. I feel like simpler is better, and Incineroar attracts me in that sense. But at the core of my heart, guys, at the core of his heart, he wants to play Joker. However, he's much harder and demanding. I would like to have your insights about simplicity in general, and how to come to the point of simplicity with complex characters, if this is even possible. This is a good question.
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think, I'll give my quick take on it. So this is going to be very common, especially in early metas. Rivals 2 just came out, or like it's open for like a week. So there's obviously a lot of characters with a lot of depth in that game, but then there's also characters with more of a simple game plan, right? And I think having a simple game plan, and I know Ramses always pushes game plans and Ultimate being very important, and the more simple a game plan is, the faster you're going to learn it in general, right? So it just depends on what you want out of the game. I mean, you can still make simple game plans with Joker, but that's not why Joker's strong. I feel like there's... I like to call them toolbox characters, where they just have a really wide variety of options. So I'm talking like Wolf, Diddy, Sheik, Joker, right? All these characters have really a wide variety of options that you can take on almost any situation in with a combination of all these options. But the hard part about digesting that is you have to go through those scenarios so many times, and you're not going to instantly learn the first time either. So you probably have to go through all of these very unique situations multiple times to understand which tool from the toolbox to use for some of these characters like Joker, and it's just going to take a lot of time. So it just depends. If you just want the quick W, why not pick Incineroar? The game plan's pretty simple, right? You have really strong tilts, you get them in the corner. Are they going to jump, or are they not going to jump? Because that's how you're going to Alolan Whip most of the time, right? Or you're going to catch them panicking out of the corner because the threat of the Alolan Whip side B is so powerful that it forces them to do other things. So your game plan's more centric around one specific scenario, which is, oh, I have my opponent in the corner and they can die from Alolan Whip. So what happens during this scenario? And when you have a character with a simple game plan, you experience those situations so much more often that I feel like you just learn the character quicker. And since you don't have to experience all of these unique scenarios, that the learning curve just feels a lot faster too. So it just depends on what you want out of the game. I mean, I think one reason I switched from Fox to Fox from Wolf was I just felt like Fox was a bit more simple. Fox is like faster to play, but at the end of the day, I just need to set up air, and then you just play a horizontal, like your neutral is just either horizontal or vertical. And it's like to me, it's pretty simple. You have to be fast, which makes it fun, but it's pretty simple compared to someone like Wolf, in my opinion. I think Wolf has a lot more depth to his neutral when we're thinking about like different matchups and stuff like that. Fox usually has pretty simple answers for damage and for neutral. So I preferred that, and I just like playing the character more. If you want to commit to Joker, it's just going to take a lot more time. So if you have the time to commit to Joker, and I mean, at the end of the day, I think for Ultimate, both of the characters you mentioned, you can just pick whichever one you have more fun with. But then the oh so deep question of what's better? Having fun with a character you enjoy, or seeing the victory screen with the number 1 next to your name, right? I think that's an age-old question that I can't really answer for you. So that's just something you're going to have to dig deep and figure out yourself. But most of the time, when someone comes up to me with a character dilemma, I don't make it too complicated. I'm just kind of like, just pick the character that you enjoy playing the most, because that'll motivate you to play the game more, thus making you better at the game, because you'll have more hours in the game and you won't be in a situation where you're forcing yourself to play. But I love the question in a sense where we're trying to break down simplicity and characters with a wide variety of options, and trying to break that down is really fun. What are your thoughts, Tony?
So I personally try to focus on simplifying it into a particular time range. So some players need to see results, if they are being honest with themselves, in order to maintain their motivation. And that, now granted, if you are going for min-maxing your performance to the highest possible levels, this does not apply to you. But in practice, most players are doing this as a hobby. They don't plan to play at a level of play that is higher than their local. And so they need to be honest with themselves. How soon do I need to see results? How long am I willing to go O2 until I start seeing those results? And how long can I go on with specifically motivation, going through these periods of times where I'm just straight up not having a good time because I'm just getting my ass beat all the time, and knowing that I'm losing with my favorite character. So from this point on, and this transcends whether it's simple or complex, but if you think that what you are going to do is going to pay off with longer time investment, then you have to set yourself up, again, being honest with yourself, usually through past experience, by going ahead and putting yourself through that ringer until you can at least hold out for that. And if you don't think you can hold out for that, that's okay. But understand that you're going to be a very miserable person until then, and that if you don't make it all the way, you're probably going to end up regretting the overall experience. But if this is also your first time, or you don't know, so let's say you've just never put that kind of time or frustration into an activity relating to a game, if you aren't certain that that's how it'll apply to you, then by all means, go through it, learn more about yourself, and going through that process is its own value because that teaches you something about yourself. If you already know that, what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to use this motivation to put in that time, then you should reach that point where you start to get a win. You go 1-2 instead of 2 or O2, and then you go 2-2 instead of 1-2. And these small improvements or results that aren't necessarily indicative of the time that you're putting in, but correlate with the time that you're putting in, the effort that you're putting into, are going to help get you to that next step where you can continue investing your time into it. As Charles mentioned, this is a matter of being able to essentially reach the full range of the positions you need to play. So the reason that simplicity is so effective when you're first starting out is because you can actually tell whether it's a square or a circle because you have reached the edges of what these situations look like, and then you can kind of act around them. If you aren't reaching to this point, then that's usually when the character is too complex for you to see immediate results with, because you don't know, well, what if my opponent does this? What if my opponent does that? And you have to spend a lot more time essentially theory crafting around how the character is going to play. I think that a common mistake that players actually make to that end is that players will get so caught up in theory crafting around the positions that their character is capable of that they actually don't play the game, and they just straight up don't experience these positions, except those uncomfortable positions, those times where, oh, well, A beats B except if Z. Then you kind of just have to experience that. If you can think through that, that's great. But if you don't already have a really big experience behind you that you can reference, I don't recommend that. I recommend just going ahead, putting the time into the game, putting in the leg hours. I think that players tend to underestimate how much faster you can learn by just playing the game, actually do the doing, than trying to think about it. if compared to going through a textbook. So obviously there will be a point where you'll start getting diminishing returns, and then as you get more diminishing returns, you'll have a higher impetus to go ahead and then switch over tracks to spending more time with theory. And that is usually once you're starting to reach like the intermediate stages and such. But when you are a beginner or introducing yourself to almost any activity, usually the highest rate of return you can do is just show up, put in time, and then you'll get the gains. And that's just all there is to it. So referencing Incineroar and Joker in particular, what you can do to kind of accelerate that process of Joker is to then look for, well, if I know I have to put in a lot of time to Joker, but I want to put in as little as time before I start getting those 1-2 benefits, then what we want to do is we want to identify how can I simplify Joker's game plan down. And this comes down to both recognizing, well, what are Joker's biggest punishes and what are the most frequent openings I can find with those punishes. Now, with the case of a character like Incineroar, usually what you're going to do is you're going to just find that most of the things that you can get hits with are also things that lead to fairly substantial punishes. Yeah. Whereas with Joker, you have a much narrower range of things I can hit my opponent with that lead to big damage or lead to big positions. And then also, what positions am I rewarded for keeping my opponent in with Joker, which is another layer of complexity that Joker has that Incineroar doesn't. So it's not that Incineroar isn't rewarded for having good positions. It's that Joker in particular is rewarded in more positions in more ways than Incineroar does, because Joker, and this is spoiler, part of why Joker is considered a better character than Incineroar is because he is capable of following up in more positions than Incineroar. So there's some positions that Incineroar just has to wait for go next and wait for gravity or the opponent trying to do something until he can act on them. Whereas Joker can just straight up reach there because of his mobility or because he has so much time to act because his frame data is better that he can act twice and then follow up on that next position because he still has some frame advantage left over from the first position. So with that said, Ramses, you are obviously going to have a better grasp of how this translates in theory once we do reach that intermediate stage.
Yeah, I am a show player. So I know all about playing complex characters. In a sense that, well, how do you make it work? And I thought a lot about the value of complex characters in this game because I think, and I'm sure you guys agree. I think the common sentiment from the community is like, why play a hard character like Joker, etc., when you can just play an easy character and succeed? And I personally think that is the wrong approach. So I think there's three main points that I want to bring up here, and I think the first one, and I think the one that kind of sets the tone, is you got to know that whatever type of character you're playing, whether they're complex or simple, you're doing the same things. Like all characters in this game essentially look for a strong situation and then try to get the most out of that advantage that they gain, right? And so whether your character is complex or not, you're still making reads, you're still focusing on movement, you're still avoiding your opponent's good situations, entering your own good ones. You're at the end of the day, you're doing the same things. And so one thing about complex and simple characters is that while it seems like they play entirely different games at times, at the end of the day, it's really the same thing. And I think how I would describe the difference between complex and quote-unquote simple characters is context sensitivity. That's the way I think about it. And so we can kind of largely divide the cast into characters that are very sensitive to context. And so these are usually more complex. And then there's characters that are very insensitive to complex, and these are often more simple. And so to put that in layman's terms, when you're playing Incineroar, most of the time your answer is going to be side B. And so you're not very sensitive to the context. Whatever the context is, whatever situation you find yourself in, side B. Whenever you're getting juggled, down B. Whenever you're juggling someone, up air, right? And so because they have these really strong tools, they are not very sensitive to context. This is kind of a necessity for characters like Incineroar. And another good example of this would be a character like Corrin, who kind of is insensitive to context to a large degree. Of course, not entirely, but she has to be. And the reason why for both these characters is that they're slow. And so if you're a slow character, you have to be insensitive to context because you don't have a lot of control over the context, because you cannot run around quickly. You have less control over what situation you find yourself in than the opponent does, quite simply. And so if you don't have control over what situation you're playing, you better have a tool that succeeds in most situations. Now, the flip side is also true, right? So you have these characters like Joker, like Aegis, that are extremely fast, but or even Younglink. I think Younglink is like probably the best example in the game to some degree. He's very insensitive in that he always has an answer, but his tools are very specific, right? And so what do these characters have in common? They're all very fast. They have a lot of control over the situation. But imagine a character that has a lot of control over the situation, but that also has a tool that works in almost all situations. He would literally be Exodia, right? Like that is Exodia level game design. And so most characters either have one or the other. So Steve, for example, has, because of his speed, relatively little control over situations. Now his blocks do give him a lot of control, right? So that's why blocks are so broken. But outside of blocks, right? I don't know, it's hard to divorce Steve from the blocks, but bear with me for the sake of example. Outside of blocks, Steve has relatively little control over the situation. It's just that whatever the situation is, he probably has a strong tool. Oh, I'm at a disadvantage. Down air a minecart, right? And so you have these characters that are relatively insensitive to context. They usually rely on a few strong tools, and so they become simple. Because you don't really have to care about the situation you're in, because in any given situation, you press the same button. And so what you find yourself in here, what the situation you find yourself in, is that you're playing one character that does not care about the context and one character that does. And so if you're used to playing Incineroar, right, or you know, it sounds like he's the character you're most successful with, so I assume you've played him enough, even if you don't play him much anymore. You might have low-key trained yourself to focus mostly on capitalizing on any given situation rather than creating the right situation. Does that make sense? So these characters, like if you think about the game again, we're going to use the Ramses system, right? Strategy, situation, context, or sorry, strategy, situation, interaction. Situation being your context and interaction being the RPS that you're playing in the moment, right? And so these simple characters, they don't have a lot of control over the context, over the strategy, and so they focus a lot on playing the interaction well. Whereas characters like Aegis, like Joker, because they have so much control over the context, they usually struggle to play the interactions well, right? Because they only have very specific tools. It's kind of like I have 100 tools and you have like 2, and I can still succeed, but I have to pick the right one out of the 100, whereas you get to pick the right one out of the 2, right? And so what you got to do with these characters that are very sensitive to context is you got to focus on creating the right context. And sometimes that means going in 2 layers in context creation. So what does that mean? Well, for Incineroar, for example, you can say, okay, my opponent whiffed. That's enough. I'm stronger. Here comes the side B. You just run at them, start hitting them. For Joker, you can say, hey, they just whiffed something. But if I interact with them now, because they have such strong interactions, right? Playing against, for example, Incineroar, they can probably still interact with me favorably, right? Like this is good, but it's not good enough because the way I interact is not that generically powerful. And so what happens is that as the Joker player in that situation, you might have to go a layer deeper. And so you say, hey, I found they whiffed. I'm now stronger. Let's apply some pressure, feint it, see if they overcommit to defend themselves. So think about like let's say it's an Incineroar, they do like a landing up air, and then they defend themselves by throwing out, I don't know, like a down smash, right? Which is something that Incineroar tend to do to like counter, and then you punish the down smash. See? So it's often the threat of that good situation that leads to a situation that is good enough for you to have like actually favorable interactions, like favorable enough for you to commit to them. Let's put it that way. And so as a Joker player, as a player of a character who is sensitive to context, what you want to do is you want to hyper focus on that context. And in other words, you want to hyper focus on the situation at hand. And oftentimes a situation that is good enough for a character like Incineroar or even Corrin, right? These characters with like these big lasting hitboxes that have a lot of power behind them, often is not good enough for you to commit. And so that's the second thing. So the first thing I said is like, essentially you're doing the same thing, right? So the skill that's being checked is very similar. And I've kind of explained how the nuance is different in that if you're a context sensitive character, you're focusing mostly on the context, right? You want to focus on your strength. And the final thing that I want to say, and this is something that I really like, I thought about a lot actually. And that is, I want to talk a little bit about the engine, Ultimate's engine in general. Because what I've kind of concluded by just looking at the current meta and just the the sheer power of a lot of these context insensitive characters, right? So in other words, these characters that just go for interactions whenever they're stronger. What I've kind of found is that the complexity found within any individual character is not as necessary for success as a lot of people think, right? And so as one of, if not, like, as let's just say, as one of the best Shoks in the world when I was actively competing, I think I really tapped a lot into the complexity that Shok had. And what I've kind of found as I increase the complexity of my game plan by adding more mix-ups for the opponent to be aware of, what I found is that the mix-ups that I already had were good enough, right? And so when we think about like a Spargo playing Cloud is an extremely simple character, right? Like one of the simplest in the game, reliance on back air, kind of goes from back air to go everywhere. And there's a lot of complexity still, right? Because again, if you're a character like Cloud and you're wrong, you get punished hard, so you have to be very accurate. Sure, right? Like I'm not saying the character is easy. I'm saying compared to a lot of like the more harder characters in the cast, he is simple, right? So take a character like Cloud. He has short off back air, and within the realm of short off back air and maybe one or two complementary moves, you have a well-rounded moveset. You have enough mix-up within just the things you can do in the engine to fully mix someone up and attack their mental stack. And so the question you should ask yourself is like, what does the complexity of a character like Joker, of a character like Shulk, etc., what does that really give you, right? Like, what does that complexity add to your game plan? And the answer, in my opinion, often is not much, because you already have enough. And so I think there is a point in any game's meta where these complex characters become more powerful as you become used to playing like your fundies. And they're at a point where you fully, like, quote unquote, master them, right? To the degree that is possible. There is a point where the complexity becomes valuable. But think about it this way, right? We're now like almost 6 years into Ultimate, right? I think we are. Yeah, we're almost 6 years into Ultimate.
More.
More. I think it was end of 2018, right?
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be almost 6 years. Anyway, doesn't matter.
6 years about, yeah.
Yeah, we're really far into Ultimate's lifespan. And if you think about it, and I'm sure you guys would agree, if we look at the top level players, most of them have not fully mastered the engine yet. Right, guys?
Yeah.
I would say
I mean, to be fair, it's a very hard game to master. Like, I think, I mean, I don't think Smash 4 was mastered at the end of it, but I think Smash 4, in terms of how demanding the game was, like, there was like more tech in Smash 4, but the sheer amount of speed that you have to play in Ultimate is extremely demanding. Like, speed and reactions are way more of a thing in Ultimate than it was in Smash 4. Smash 4 was a lot... As someone who's older, I appreciated how slow paced Smash 4 was. It was easier for me to keep up. Ultimate is very difficult.
I've seen a top 10 player accidentally double roll just today. So in tournament, like, it's still back to the basics on mechanics as far as I'm concerned.
Right, and so we are 6-ish years into Ultimate, and we still haven't mastered the fundamentals yet. And so if you're investing into complexity, that time comes at the cost of investing into the fundies, right? Like the fundament, like just mastering the engine itself. And at this point, right, in the meta at least, we're at a point where just by playing the fundamental concepts in the game, you already have a well-rounded game plan. And so my advice to most people, like, explore that complexity of your character if you want to, but more than anything, just learn the fundamental aspects of the game and utilize that, translate that into a well-rounded game plan and go from there. Because the complexity at this moment, it's not worth it in terms of the time that you're investing, looking at the current climate. I do think there's merit for it, right? Like, in terms of, like, if you learn this crazy banjo confirm, you can get like an early kill, and like that stuff, like, it's fun at the very least, and it can also be very powerful. But when we're talking about, like, I have this new playstyle that revolves around using Banjo Grenade to stall for time infinitely under the stage, I'm like, yeah, like, you can do that. But you don't need that, right? And so, like, if we're doing that, we're mostly doing that for fun, not necessarily because we know it's like an efficient route to winning. Anyway, those were the three things I wanted to say. I think it's all the same in the end. I think what you're looking for is like, are you focusing on like the situation creation, or are you focusing on kind of like acting on a situation in front of you and identifying kind of what category your character falls into? And it's a bit of both. Always, it's a bit of both. But there's definitely a focus for most characters, and also identifying where your opponent lands. Right. So if you're playing like Aegis versus Joker, you're both vying for position most of the time. But if you're playing Joker versus Incineroar, you are doing the vying for positions, right? And so like the interactions is all him. And then finally, something that I do want you to keep in mind, if you're playing like these characters that are more complex, don't make it complex for complexity's sake, because really there is enough complexity to have a well-rounded game plan within just the base mechanics of Ultimate.
I will also say that I believe this topic runs parallel to our discussion on the episode on mental stack, when you are first starting the game and entering intermediate phase is when you generally want to keep it simple and then move toward complexity. But then once you've actually pulled out your game and examined these processes, it's time to simplify it again. So at that point, even if you are already the best player in your region, what you want to do is you want to move the challenge that you are facing into a higher challenge rate so that you'll essentially go up the bell curve on complexity. And then once you reach the peak of that bell curve, as things start to become more challenging, it's time to simplify it again. And as Ramses is saying, at that point, it becomes a matter of why are you overthinking things when you already have a set of circumstances, and it's more a matter of mastering the circumstances and essentially learning to control the circumstances around your opponent so that your opponent's just playing your game more often rather than trying to define what is the game. So that's not an important question that you have to answer if you understand how you win the game, even if you don't know what the game is. So at that point, it is then to the player to understand how you can kind of simplify that down. And again, going down to having the higher reward options, this again is going to be something that correlates with that, because it's usually a matter of how can I reduce the number of game interactions I need in order to win the game so that I can more consistently execute that, so that I am having to think about fewer positions within the game, so that I'm having to give my opponent less opportunities to try and play solitaire with their own character. So if they don't have the complexity to match me, but I give them enough times that they can just keep rolling dice at me, then that's more likely to go well for them than me if I'm already confident in the range of what my dice rolls are. So that's a way of leveraging your own ability over the opponent, is by just choosing to focus on the tracks that you know are winning for you. And to that note, I will also note that Incineroar and Joker, again, as characters, if you are playing at lower skill levels, the importance of having a stronger character is actually less important until you can reach the points where actually maximizing the utility of those strengths increases. So again, until you're actually reaching that kind of intermediate or advanced player level, it's not really that much of a difference in character efficacy between Joker and Incineroar. So don't think of it as a matter of, oh, well, this is a top tier, this is a low tier. Maybe that is true for some games. Within Smash Ultimate in particular, the cast is balanced enough that usually at the lower levels of play, the simplicity is actually more important than the actual character power overall. So yes, Joker is better than Incineroar, but is your Joker better than Incineroar? As we know already in this specific example, no. But I would also go so far as to say that's probably a correct dynamic for most players who play Incineroar and Joker. Incineroar is generally going to be a better character at that skill level for most people by definition, because most players are not intermediate. Most players are not advanced players. So I do think that is a fairly common situation.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I want to touch up on for this topic is, I think one of the core parts of the game that is probably the hardest, I'll go ahead and say it's probably the hardest aspect of the game, is movement in neutral. It's very difficult, especially if you have a very fast character. Now fast, there's a bunch of different, there's ground speed, there's air speed. Like Wario's fast in the air, but he's not fast on the ground, right? So there's different types of speed that you're dealing with when we're talking about movement, and really correlating all of that so you can do feints, and whiff punish from there. It is very difficult to whiff punish in ultimate because auto L canceling is turned on, so you have to be very precise when you whiff punish. I think that's one of the things that newer players have the most amount of trouble with. So when you are playing a movement-based character like Joker, you are more so playing. You're playing a very different game than a proactive, like a proactive game plan.
Roy.
Right, I'm throwing out these hitboxes and you have to deal with these hitboxes, right? So more of the simple characters have this strategy. Roy, Cloud, right? I have Corrin. These are very, very good characters when we talk about their proactive hitboxes. I'm going to throw out this hitbox in this area, and unless you parry, and even if you do parry a max space Cloud back air, you might be able to punish it depending on how low to the ground it is, how safe it is. But generally, they're just really strong hitboxes that you can proactively control space with, and that is a much more simple strategy. Maybe not easier. I think it's easier, but for some people, it just depends on what's easy for you and not. But it is definitely less reactive, right? As to where when you're playing a movement-based character, how often you have to react and how fast you have to do it is very demanding. And I will say one thing too is even if you do have more success with Incineroar, that won't last forever. Eventually, you will get good enough at the game where you will start hitting a ceiling. And I know Tony was mentioning this earlier as well. So you will eventually hit limitations with Incineroar where you're like, oh man, before I could just do X, Y, and Z and I'll just get the dub. But now, like every time I try to run towards my opponent, I'm getting smacked up by these projectiles or what have you, right? Like you are going to see the struggles of Incineroar, maybe not now, but you will see them in the future. So the I could just go in Incineroar and win thing is not going to last forever, and eventually you will be good at you will continue to get better at the game. But it just kind of depends on how you want your experience with the game to be. Do you want to be the guy that can prove that Incineroar can do it? Do you believe that Incineroar is better than everyone thinks, right? Like SkyJ did that. So it's not impossible to do. I think that road is pretty difficult because usually if you're the first player to make a character work, you kind of just have to figure it out and execute and travel and do all this other stuff. Like it costs a lot of money to prove a point. Let's just put it that way for Smash Brothers. So it just depends on what you want your journey to be. But right now it sounds like Incineroar is racking you more Ws. But like I said, that will not last forever. You will hit walls with Incineroar, and then Joker is going to be the character where you have more options against certain things where you're like, man, in this matchup with Incineroar, I just feel like I can't do anything because at a certain range, I can't even really dash. I have to start walk shielding and all this other stuff, right? Whereas Joker, I could just whiff punish, or I could threat X, Y, or Z, or I have the movement to put the pressure onto the character. So just know that there will be limitations later on with Incineroar if you just do decide to go with Incineroar. But whereas Joker, the start is going to be a bit more rough, but that's just because you're intaking more parts of the game. So Incineroar either can't do certain parts of the game or he skips certain parts of the game. Whereas Joker, you are for the most part playing the entirety of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. So because of that, you're intaking way more information, so the learning process will just be slower. But it just depends on, pick your poison. Do you want the process to be slower, right? Or do you want the process to seem faster now, but then you'll hit, speed bumps later on? I think that's the main thing. Ramses, did you have any final points?
I was wondering, what do you guys, like Charles Free specifically, because I know Tony commented on this already. What do you think is the value of adding complexity into your game plan?
That's
a good question, right?
Yeah, I feel like this game's too hard to add layers of complexity, and it's very specific because when I'm watching or if Tweak's talking to me about some kind of Diddy tech that gives him movement, I would say for most other players it's not worth, but I think for his situation it's unique and different, and that's what motivates him literally to play the game. So it depends if it is a motivating factor for you and it encourages you to play the game and it makes the game feel fresh to you, which motivates you to then play the game more, I would say yes. I would say for 99% of people on this planet, probably not worth it. I think just having a simple game plan is super important. And what else? Mom, I'm recording.
That's about it.
Yeah.
No, that's fair. I think that's a fair opinion.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if I had anything else to say on it, but I think I just think in general, no, just because this game's so fast. I think in a game like Smash 4, if I was to draw parallels, it's a lot easier to implement tech because your mental stack wasn't overwhelmed 24/7. I think in Ultimate, it's a bit demanding, and for me, I think if you can like kill confirms are usually worth it, or things that do like a lot of damage. I think that's the only time. Like, if I were to main Banjo in tournament, I would practice the brutal cancel confirm that gets kills at like 60 or 70. That's something you have to be able to do, even though it's super hard. But movement tech and stuff like that, and then when you look at Steve cashes out super hard off of nils and stuff like that because nil applies to every part of the game because you can nil neutral, you can nil kill confirms. Like it's pretty crazy.
I think if your character has like a unique mechanic, like Diddy Banana or like Shulkman Auto Arts or like Steve blocks, etc., like you have to, because that is what makes your character work. But for something like Joker, Joker is a complex character, but he doesn't really have anything like super unique about him.
He's definitely not as complex as some of the other characters you just mentioned. So like
in terms of mechanics, right?
Right. I think comparatively to Incineroar, yes, but
yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's all I want to know. I think that's a good take. Yeah, I think I've said my piece on simplicity. I think it's important to understand. Like, I think it's easy to say, oh, my character is complex or my character is simple. But knowing what that means, right? Like, how is that actuated in a game, right? Like, I am complex. Okay, so what? What patterns does that introduce? What does that mean about your decision making? Like, where can you see that, and how can you act on it? I think that's way more important. And so, like, it's good to recognize this difference in complexity. I think what is more important is to recognize, like I said, what does that mean? What does that lead to? And so that's why I think understanding like the sensitivity to context is so important. But yeah, that's all I wanted to add. Any final words on your end, Tony?
No, I think you guys covered it pretty well.
Okay.
All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the episode, enjoyed the topic. Thank you for the question. And if you guys want to ask us any questions, feel free to subscribe to our Discord, and you can go ahead and hit us up with questions on the members channel, and we'll get right to them. Of course, if you did enjoy the content, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know what your thoughts are on complex tech versus being simple. What do you think is stronger? What do you think is worth? And yeah, especially tech. I would love to hear in the comments what tech you think specifically is worth going for, like outside of the obvious, like Steve Nil and stuff like that. But until next time, class dismissed.